So good evening, everyone. I'm really honored to be hosting this conversation tonight as a guest curator at the Korean Cultural Center in New York City. Welcome to the first of our online conversations for interpreting the natural, the Contemporary Visions of Scholars' Rocks, which is opening actually today at the Korean Cultural Center in New York City. I would like to introduce the Korean Cultural Center. For anyone who's not familiar with their programs, it's a government institution. It was inaugurated in 1979 to establish and promote Korean culture and aesthetics in New York. The Korean Cultural Center is a branch of the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism in Korea, and it provides a diverse cultural and aesthetic activities, including gallery exhibitions, performing arts concerts, film festivals, and educational programs. The current exhibition is part of the Korean Cultural Center's annual Call for Artists program that selects talented artists, their artworks, as well as curated exhibitions to be presented at the Gallery Korea each year. Last year was the 40th anniversary celebration, and we'd love to share a short video to introduce the breadth and span of the work that has been accomplished. Next, I'd like to introduce the director, Joe, and he would like to make some welcoming remarks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Donna, for the introduction and for your hard work in putting all this exhibition together, and also to our curator, Hisang Jo. And I'm very excited to host this wonderful exhibition and wanted to share a few words of welcome. It has been a difficult year for all of us, but it has also been encouraging to see how the arts have brought us together. Many artists from diverse cultural backgrounds come together for this particular exhibition. There has been a growing interest in the topic of scholars' rocks in the US in recent times, thanks to the mainstream appearance in the Oscar-winning movie Parasite. Through this exhibition, I personally realized how powerful such rocks are, as they hold the small universe inside, representing an eternity and standing at the test of the time. Seeing them further come alive in contemporary art forms has been very, very fascinating. And it certainly has made me feel more humble and modest in relationship with nature. I'm very excited to hear more about the discussion and look forward to all of your insights. Thank you all again. Donna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Joe. I'm really, really honored to have the opportunity to curate this exhibition at the Korean Cultural Center. And normally we would be in person and we would have these conversations in the gallery. And so, obviously due to COVID, we're not doing that and we're staying safe. So I want to welcome our guests tonight. Due to COVID, I guess the silver lining is that we'll be having this conversation online. So tonight we have joining us Dr. Nancy Berliner. She's the Wu-Tang Senior Curator of Chinese Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She's the curator of the largest and most significant gift of Chinese paintings and calligraphy in the MFA's history from Wango H.C. Wang. She is a former curator at the Peabody Essex Museum, where she conceived and developed the landmark Yin Yu Tang House project. which brought a 200-year-old rural Chinese merchant home to the Peabody Essex Museum. We also have Timothy Springer. He's a renowned scientist, entrepreneur, and rock art collector. He's an immunologist at the Harvard Medical School and professor of medicine at the Boston Children's Hospital. He has founded many companies in Boston that have gone public, one called Scholar Rock. And he has a passion for rock collecting that is connected to his ongoing research of protein molecules. Also with us tonight, we have two artists that are featured in the exhibition. Mark Cooper is a Boston-based artist who teaches at Boston College. He's internationally recognized for his large-scale and site-specific installations. He's won artist fellowships through the Massachusetts Cultural Council and a gun travel grant for research in Japan and Korea. Mark will be talking about his work in the show. And we also have Laura Moriarty, a Hudson Valley-based artist in New York, upstate New York. She makes process-driven sculpture and works on paper whose forms, colors, textures, and patterns result from the same processes that shape and reshape the earth, such as heating and cooling, erosion, subduction, friction, and folding, weathering, and slippage. She was born in Beacon, New York, and she has received training through an apprenticeship in hand paper making and is otherwise self-taught. So I think Dr. Nancy Berliner will begin with a few remarks, and then we will go to the images. Nancy?
Thank you for inviting me to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what everybody else is going to be talking about. But I thought, since we're talking about rocks, I just thought that I would bring you all a rock, and I don't know how good the light is, but give you a sense of the size of this rock, and it's one of my favorite rocks, and you can just one of the wonderful things about Chinese rocks is that they come in all sizes. Some of them are 15 feet high and some of them are just a couple of inches. But once you start to look at them, you're overwhelmed and your mind goes into them, and they could be of any size because you become immersed in the space that they are. Donna had asked me how I first got into Chinese rocks, and I confess I grew up in a home that was filled with abstract art, and when I was freshman in college, I was taking a course and somebody started talking about Sung Dynasty art in China. So that's like 10th, 11th century art, and how the artists and philosophers at that time period became anti-representational in their comments about Chinese art, and that the focus of art in calligraphy as well as painting was all about the brush stroke and the expression that came through the brushstroke, and it wasn't about trying to imitate a natural object. It wasn't about naturalism. It was just about expression, and it also very much was not about prettiness. So that's how I got hooked on Chinese art. And once I moved to China, I went to the Central Academy of Art. And so once I moved to China, I started learning more about Chinese painting and Chinese calligraphy. And it was at that point when I suddenly discovered rocks and the Chinese passion for rocks, which really became articulated in the Tang and then the Sung dynasty. By the Tang dynasty, and especially in the Sung dynasty, there were many, many people who were collecting rocks and also articulating the aesthetics and standards of rocks and what one looks for in great rocks. And it really didn't matter that rocks did not have artists' names connected to them. They were forms, just like Chinese painting and Chinese calligraphy, and they were expressive. And some of the most important words that were associated with ranking and judging rocks were words like draw, which means awkward. So they're not looking for something that's pretty and symmetrical and beautiful, but they like the awkwardness and the asymmetry of a rock. Another word is Zhou, which means wrinkle. They're not looking for a soft or a fine surface. Wrinkled showed age, and age in China was very much respected. And another word is tou, which means penetrable, so that that the mind's eye can travel into and go through these rocks and be immersed in them. So let's go to the next slide. This is a fabulous rock. And does anybody want to show with their fingers or arms how large they think this rock is? Point is that you really can't tell, right? It could be this big, could be just a few inches, it could be a few feet wide. In fact, it's about 5 feet across. It's just a very powerful rock that fulfills all the critical standards of what a great rock is. Came from a garden in Suzhou, and it's now in a private collection. Can we go to the next slide? So there was the love of rocks, and in addition to the love of rocks for their form and their expressiveness, very early on, people started painting rocks. This is a rock that was collected by a very important official in the late 16th, early 17th century. Mi Wanzhong, he had enormous rocks and he had little teeny rocks. He was just a rock fanatic. And he asked an artist named Wu Bin to come and paint his rocks. And this was one of his favorite rocks. And he asked Wu Bin to create a portrait of it. And Wu Bin decided instead of making one painting, he would actually make 10 paintings of this rock. You can see at the top of this slide some of those 10, and then this is one of the 10. So it's just a detail of the whole long hand scroll. This is considered one of the greatest paintings of the last 2 dynasties in China. And nobody really knew about it until it appeared on the market in 1989 in New York. And then it went into a private collection, and it was just re-auctioned off Sunday morning, our Sunday morning in New York. I don't know if any of you know about this, but it broke all records for Chinese painting at auction. So it's a fabulous painting. We don't know who owns it now, but hopefully it will eventually be in a museum so it can be shared with the world. Next slide. And I just want to finish my remarks with a couple of works that are at the Museum of Fine Arts. On the left, you see a wonderful, enormous 14-foot high Taihu rock that was donated to the museum, I think about 20 years ago, by a man named Richard Rosenblum, along with other funds given by private individuals to the museum. Richard was, if anybody doesn't know him, really one of the greatest collectors in America of Chinese rocks, and one of the people who pushed the understanding and the passion for Chinese rocks in America, and really in many ways revived the love of rocks in China today. Richard was first and foremost an artist, but at some point in his life, he suddenly discovered Chinese rocks and he got so excited, and it completely changed his own attitude towards art as well as his own sculpture. The work on the right is a piece of bronze that he made, and it's very much his reaction to Chinese rocks and the ability of using nature to express the dynamism of the cosmos and art and life and energy. And I'm going to wrap it up there and pass the wand on to the next speaker, and welcome your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So I think I loved how you tied the ancient into the contemporary, and the timing of Richard Rosenblum. I know the rocks had a lot of showings in the late 90s at the Med and the MFA in Harvard. So the timeline was really helpful for me to understand the appreciation of rocks. So Tim, are you ready to go?
I am.
Great.
So I'm a collector, and I learned all of the aesthetics that Nancy Berliner just presented, and I had many rocks that follow those aesthetics, including some Lingby stones, which was a subject of the famous painting she showed. And Lingbys are so hard that you can strike them and they sound like you've struck on a bronze bell. They have a ring to them, and collectors value that. I'd like to talk about some of the material features in the rocks today. I really love the way that rocks, when they're washed by very strong rivers, and then rocks get caught in them, and you can have a crevice that a rock would get caught in, and it acts like a pestle to grind out a hole, like in a mortar. And and the rocks also respond by showing there are different veins in them, because almost all of them are metamorphic, and some veins are harder than others, and that pattern becomes apparent, from this wear process happening over many years. So in China, actually, almost all the rocks that we think of in classical rocks, like Lingby stones, were depleted hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And once the Chinese are so that once they discover a new source of rocks, there's a frenzy, they buy it, and it's rapidly depleted. And what you're looking at now is from a trip I took to China that was hosted by two dealers, one from a large city, and the other one who had a shop in Guangxi province in the town of Luzhou. And there's an extraordinary rock museum in Luzhou too that any of you, if you have a chance, should go to. And Luzhou is the center of the current rock market in China, which centers around all the rocks that were discovered in the Han River. These rocks, the rocks we're looking at right now, come off the bottom of this river about 40 meters down. Depending on what geologic formation, what rock stratum the river is running through, we have different rocks downstream. And these are what the Chinese have found in their, the way they value things, to being the most valuable rocks. They're called Dawa rocks because they come from Dawa County, where the river cuts through it. And this lady is making us a lunch, and we're having a meal in a dealer's store. He's a friend of the dealer I was hosted by. And you know, these Dawa rocks look like sedimentary rock formations, like you might see in the American Southwest. But they're very hard, and they can be translucent. And the Chinese have always valued jade. Jade is translucent, and so if you ever look at jade, they want to hold a light up to it. And the Han Dynasty, the dominant dominant force in China, you know, buried people, and this was well into the Bronze and Iron Age, with emblems of power next to them if they were high up. Those emblems were axes, and they were stone axes. And those stones are products of the Neolithic culture. You know, we're familiar with Paleolithic, where like the Indians of North America chipped obsidian and made flakes, and these were rough surfaces. But the stone axes are Neolithic rocks. They're very hard, but people learn how to polish them. And jade is very hard. And so I've also gotten some. If you could, I guess, turn off the slides for a second and show me, Donna. So these are some tools from China. These actually were they were ground twice. They were ground when they were manufactured to make them into specific shapes. And then they were ground again because they were lost in the river. And some of these were, for example, you know, discovered when sand was being excavated from rivers. And some of them are translucent. You can see when you hold a light up to it. And those would be, you know, the most valued ones. And others are not translucent. You know, so this is something that's of great importance to the Chinese. You know, and these were, you know, this was something of great value. And so in Neolithic times, we think that a man of important stature would walk around, you know, with a stone implement, you know, in his belt, and that would mark, you know, his rank, what kind of a tool he was allowed to carry. And I think some of that ancient love of rocks and jade has really permeated Chinese culture to this day. And it's seen, for example, in the value that these Dawa rocks fetch. And I've been in many. It's funny that rock collecting in China is dominated by men. And I think there might be something about evolution, you know, with men being responsible for making tools, that men have a particular affection that's wired into the genes, I think. Just like, you know, if we're up somewhere high and we have green around us and we have a view down below of a body of water, that always looks beautiful to us, because those are very safe places. I mean, I think that's a kind of beauty that's hardwired into our genome in a similar way. But I visited many rock collectors' houses in China. They were all men. Although my rock teacher here in Newton, Massachusetts, is a female, Kim and Hu, and she got her rocks originally from her father, who was quite a successful connoisseur in China. But you know, take it or leave it. I know that a lot of men, you know, also, well, if they like rocks too much, they can get in trouble with their wives. I have, you know, personal experience with that. So let me go back to the images. Could we look at the next image, Donna? Yes. So let's go to the next one now. And so I built a new house in 2010, and I saw this image in a slideshow, and I was very moved by it. Here we have scholars, gathering, probably to discuss poetry and art and so on. And there's a rock beside their pavilion that is, as the same scale as the pavilion. And I said, so that's what I need. I need to go to, I was planning a trip to China, and I wanted to find a rock on that scale to go with my new house. Next image. And so we wound up near the Hong River in Guangxi province, where these rocks are brought up from the bottom of the river at the risk to the lives of many of the farmers nearby. Many lost their lives bringing these rocks up to the surface with cables, all free diving. And we see the karst landscape in the background. And these rocks are of a similar, similar mineral, and they have different patterns in them. So the one on our far left, if you could mouse over it, maybe Donna, there's a nice white one. Yes, that's it. That has very sharp edges on it. That is much softer than the rocks I bought, that had much softer edges, much more rounded, indicating that they were much harder material. And A-Song here and my other dealer didn't want me to buy a rock like that on the left because they thought that it wouldn't stand up to the water and the ice and all, that freezing in the Boston weather. So, but anyhow, we did find a rock among the collection here along the road that now stands beside my house. And this is a kind of rock called Duan, because we're in Duan province here. And I did not, my teacher here in Newton didn't connect me with any of these people. I discovered them through academic connections to scientists in China. And the first time I saw a Duan stone was actually in Guang at Sun Yat-sen University in Guangdong province. And when I discovered it was a Duan stone, I knew I had to go to Duan. Next slide, please. And so this is a Duan rock being installed outside my house. We spent a lot of time finding exactly the right position for it. Kim and Hu, my teacher about scholar rocks here in Newton, was with me and helped cite this one. But this one has a hole in it that goes all the way through, and you might notice that the strap that is being held up by, that my arm is next to, it goes all the way through the stone. Yeah, so it's really quite remarkable, what the wear patterns can reveal in the stone. This one somehow looked like it has the head of a crocodile, so I call it my Crocodile Rock. And a number of the rocks really inspired me. So for 5 of them, I wrote poems for them. And I sort of want to do that partly because it would be the scholarly tradition. If you have like a scroll painting, somebody else might write a poem for it. And it might not be the artist, it might be one of his friends who writes the poem on the scroll. But in this case, I wrote the poems. That was really maybe my only artistic contribution in a very small way. But when they were engraved on, I hired a Chinese sculptor to engrave them. I actually had them translated into Mandarin as well. And so they were carved twice, once in English and once in Chinese. And she was astonished. She works with granite and so on, but she was astonished how hard this rock was. And she went through so many diamond tools engraving it. She couldn't believe it. So Mark is one of the artists who's going to be presenting. His studio is just a block away from my house. So Mark, you're going to have to come over here and see those rocks and see what it looks like now. So thank you very much, Donna.
Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful. And I have photographed that rock, and there's a wonderful little oasis in the middle, like that makes a reflecting pool.
Yeah,
and
that's what the strap is going through.
It's great to see that again. Thank you so much for your remarks and tying it into jade tools. And that painting. That was a wonderful segue into Mark too.
Thank you, Donna, for including me and the Korean Cultural Center. I'm so honored and pleased to be part of this. These are kind of a conceptual take on rocks, and I've been interested in rocks and nature and this sort of interface between humans and nature, I think my whole creative life. And including just how they're displayed, which has to do with the bases these are on. And the other side has a ceramic tile that's painted in the center on both of them, and other sort of painted imagery. And I guess if you would proceed to my images, Donna, that would be great.
Okay.
So this is a recent installation, permanent installation at University Museum in Jingzhen, China, where porcelain comes from. And they invited me to do this permanent installation. So the sculptural form in the center really is one thinking about rocks, but it's also one thinking about display. It's thinking about nature. And it's thinking about, in my mind, just the whole history of you go into a home anywhere in the world and you see the collection of different things speaking to each other. And rather than, everything there I made collaboratively, and I've had the great fortune of a number of museum shows and installations in Korea and Vietnam and China in the past several years. And I always try to collaborate with artists and all kinds of people from those places. So there's a lot of collaboration that went on in this project, not just me alone. But I like the idea that each object is beautiful and magical in and of itself, but that the combination, the sum of the parts, is greater than the individual parts. This is at the Kemper Museum in Kansas City. And that wall goes up 35 feet. The curator and the director of the museum said it's the first time an artist had ever used the entire height. And what was kind of fascinating about that wall is when I and others were right underneath it, it felt like being under a waterfall. But from back a ways, looked really different. And those objects on the wall, well, there's a combination of photographs, of paintings, of sort of sculptural shelves as display with ceramic and other objects, and a paper I actually got in China where I do sort of reverse prints. And that paper is transparent if you use it as a collage element over, let's say, the photographs of the paintings, but I also use it as a sculptural element, and it mirrors the organic forms of the sculpture. And I guess if you go to the next slide, that would be great. So these are some details of a commission, three permanent marble sculptures that I just installed at the Da Nang Museum of Fine Arts in Da Nang, Vietnam. So I had the good fortune and opportunity to have a museum show at the National Museum of Vietnam in Hanoi. And the curator from the Da Nang Museum saw it, was aware of it, and invited me to have an exhibition. And both of them, fortunately, were very popular and well received. And the curator asked if I was interested in doing permanent sculptures for the front of the Da Nang Museum. When I was there for the installation, I spent most of my time installing, but I did discover that Da Nang is actually famous for its marble. And they have a place called Marble Mountain where they at least used to get marble from. I think they get it from other places. And I thought as a 21st century contemporary artist, marble is kind of a tough thing to do something innovative with after Greek marbles and Michelangelo marbles and Buddhist marbles from Asia. But one of the things that I'm really interested in personally as an artist is when I work with clay, I work with it in a very natural way, sort of encouraging it to fold and bend and do what it can do. And I thought it would be really interesting to translate marble into what these little clay objects could do. And so working with a mini generation marble carver in Da Nang who helped do all the carving for the large ones, I made clay originals which got blown up to 10-ton huge marble sculptures. And the image in the back is a detail so you can kind of see a little better up close what the marble's like. But you know, the title of this project was Unbounded, and it was thinking of unbounded joy and optimism and hope and, you know, infinite possibilities. And it was kind of a gift to the museum and to the people of Vietnam and all over the world. It's a destination for a lot of tourists as sort of an anti-monument. It's not celebrating a political leader or anything like that. It's really welcoming and encouraging people to again, work together, because this, you know, as I said in the other installation, the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts. And to me, that's a metaphor for if we work together, we can solve COVID, we can solve a lot of the world's problems rather than doing them separately. I thought it was really amazing to see these sculptures at the sculptor's workshop where he has these very classic pieces in the rear.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I am happy to answer questions in the Q&A. And again, thank you for including me.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. I love the perforations in the ear, as Nancy mentioned, that that's one of the value of the stones, that you can see through it and how your mind enters it. And I don't know if you mentioned it, but the inlay is also black marble.
The inlay, the skill is amazing. The inlay is black marble, so it's absolutely seamless. And everything everyone has been saying so far rings so true. Just appreciation of nature, appreciation of kind of things that aren't perfect. You know, they're off center. They refer to age. They refer, you know, to humanity and what we are. And I was lucky to be friends with Richard Rosenblum. We exhibited in the same gallery in New York years ago and in Boston and traveled a little bit together. So I learned from him a lot about rocks early on in my creative life.
Thank you so much. I think we'll go now to Laura Moriarty.
So these are images that are in the current show that we're gathering for. And these are encaustic on washi, large sheets of Asian paper, handmade Japanese paper. And I usually work with sculpture and work on paper in tandem. So I build these forms out of pigmented beeswax that are inspired by rocks and that use rocks as a reference. And for these particular scrolls, I was making them with this show expressly in mind. So I used Kim Hu's book and the photographs in it to sort of guide the movement of the wax objects that I make to make these marks along the paper. And, you know, I'm making them in tandem. This is so hard to talk about. The forms are solid pigmented beeswax, and they are like rocks, but my project has always been about, more than anything else, just time, the time that you put into making objects, and kind of a parallel reference to the time that you can see expressed in something like looking at the Grand Canyon. And so I'm kind of playing with the comparison of human time and deep geologic time. And this just keeps me going. It goes back and forth between, you can do the next image, Donna.
Mhm.
Maybe it'll be the objects.
Mhm.
Because when you see the objects, it becomes a little easier to explain how they're made. So imagine me taking those objects that are solid wax, but are made by creating little pieces that get embedded into larger pieces, and just kind of letting them form on their own as organically as possible, using really simple processes, just melting the wax and working with it when it's fluid, and then letting it cool and starting to carve and cut and burnish the surface and shape them. I build molds and pour the hot wax into it and embed things as I'm going along. And so basically what I'm making are these customized crayons. And then I take them, and as I'm shaping them, I'm also drawing them out on a hot metal plate, and then laying the paper down almost like an exquisite scroll, where I'm just picking up sections and letting them overlap and letting the image build that way. And it's really all about pace and timing. I mean, when I was thinking about how I'm inspired by Chinese scholars' rocks, it's really hard to pinpoint how that happened. It was really just being a rock hound in general. And when I travel, I'm looking at road cuts, and I'm looking at just the way that the sedimentation and the different layers are piling up. And then sometimes really surprising things happen in those layers, the strata. And that's always really been a fascination for me. But at a certain point, I became really dissatisfied with the discourse around abstract painting. And I wanted my work to participate in a conversation that was not really about art only, but about the world we live in. And so I turned to geology and the way that geology can tell stories, and started to think of the pieces that I make almost as if they're books, and as if you can read them like a book. And it's really just the process, like this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And you know, just really straight out experience with the material, using very simple hand tools, very simple processes, but letting the work be very complicated, if that makes any sense. Let's see. So this is just a detail of some of the objects, and you can get a sense that they're rough and craggy, and have lots of texture, and then also there are very refined places. And I'm really just working like an archaeologist, trying to discover what is in them. And I'm burying things. I think of it like salting the dig, where you're actually burying something in order to be able to rediscover it. You can go on to the next one.
Okay.
And this is just a detail of a couple of the pieces. But, you know, this was made as one really quite large sculpture. And I just kept changing it, taking, you know, cutting it, carving it, breaking it. And you see evidence of all of that. Like there are rough edges, there are smooth surfaces, there are many objects buried, and also these sort of concentric lines that start to form patterns in the work. And this is expressed as well in the work on paper. So again, it goes back and forth, back and forth. And it's really a struggle for control and letting go. And for me, it just becomes a metaphor for time, for how we live, how we spend our time. I think that's good.
Okay, great. I love the connection of the not only of the wax objects to rocks, but of the your drawings or paintings to scrolls and even ink painting.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I think I'm going to open it up now. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to just have some conversations, some questions from the audience. Again, I feel very fortunate that I was selected to be a curator for this exhibition, to bring, an East-West dialogue into view. I think at a time of deep political visions, it was really inspiring to hear Mark's comments about working together, coming together, Laura's comments about our humanity, and thinking about these origins and really cross-cultural connections are very rich. We look at the past, we see contemporary art, and so I'm just fascinated by all of that. Would anyone like to start off with a question?
I have a question for Laura. Hi, Laura. I admire Laura for a long time. She's a wonderful and committed artist. And I want to know if you realize how you talk about the layers, geology, and how much you connect the past, the present, with a contemporary view. Your work feels so contemporary, even the content. You talk about geology and the past, and if you're conscious about that.
Well, yeah, I suppose I am, but I try not to be self-conscious about it when I'm making the work. My work's always been, I've always wanted to have a reference outside of myself so that my work is not just choices that I'm making in order to make something beautiful. I really want the process to make something beautiful, and I want to be part of the process, but I don't want it to be all about me. So that's what really brought me to rocks, because, I used to travel around and just collect them because I was fascinated with them. And I would look at the rock, and the rock, I developed these ways of just seeing into the rock and looking more deeply than the surface, looking really deeply at, like, what are these colors? Which one came first? They were probably more saturated at one time than rocks fade, they age and kind of sadden. But I try to think of them, as being juicier somehow. And again, that whole system that Nancy was talking about earlier, about how you evaluate sort of the characteristics of the scholars' rocks or spirit stones, that was really interesting to me. I really enjoy using that as a way of sort of thinking about the forms that I make and, determining, like, does it have movement? Does it have openings? Does it draw you in? When I make the sort of, making the work and showing the work is two separate activities for me. When I'm making, I'm not really very conscious about, trying to say anything in particular. But when it comes to presenting them, I start to take that a little more seriously. And then I might become a little more self-conscious about, what kind of story the work is telling and how it might connect with a larger story. Does that make sense? Does that answer? I'm being like Joe Biden now. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see, Laura Canamila, do you want to ask your question?
Nancy Berliner wrote about scholars' rocks being a witness to the expansiveness of time, like beyond this moment and perhaps beyond the concept of moments. And as I was listening to everybody talk, it seemed like that, seemed to apply to the contemporary art and, in addition to the scholars' rocks too. Does anyone want to comment about that or expand on that, or if Nancy wants to give us words about that too, because it was just such a wonderful comment to have read from her.
That thought for me came from my own feelings and not necessarily from concepts of Chinese art. I spend a lot of time just looking at rocks, little rocks and big rocks. I happen to live next to a stream that is filled with enormous rocks. It's kind of like a giant rockery, but it's just right there in the backyard. And I just think of everything that they have seen over the past 10,000 years. And, you know, people are walking by, animals are walking by, and the rocks are really just witnesses and witnesses to how long and big time is.
Great.
I guess
Thank you.
if I were to add to that with my work, the viewer is integral to my work, and the experiences the viewer brings, and those experiences change over time, and hopefully they change for decades and decades, so that the work resonates to people with different histories, with different cultural backgrounds, and it actually speaks to a variety of people and places and things. And I think it's the same, you know, looking at a sunset, looking at a full moon, sitting by the ocean. We all bring wherever we are to those experiences, and they change every day, and we're drawn back every day to look again and again.
Great. Does anyone else want to respond? Tim or Laura, did you want to respond to that idea about being a witness or beyond this moment?
No, I think what everybody said so far is,
Okay.
I mean, I could throw some words out, but.
Yeah. I also think of geologic time. It's a time scale that we can't comprehend as people, you know, because it can extend back hundreds of millions of years. It's the kind of thing that you see, you know, at the Grand Canyon, but it's just beyond human comprehension to understand times that long. And these rocks, you know, I think about it. Well, I have Roxbury pudding stone rocks here, you know, that form some walls and so on. And it's the state stone of Massachusetts is also, it's at the Gettysburg Monument. It holds together, you know, under great duress. So pudding stone rocks, initially they were formed around Brazil, and then through plate tectonics, you know, they were subducted and moved up here, and eventually, you know, came to the surface, and, you know, they're quarried to make many churches downtown, Boston College, for example. But the rocks that I collect, I think about their formation process, not, you know, while they were under the ground and being heated and being deformed under, you know, just pressure that's unimaginable inside, you know, the upper mantle of the earth. And then, you know, the process of formation that they experienced underwater, you know, when they were being carved. And I have no idea how long that process is. I do know that, you know, you only have an interesting rock to look at if it's trapped in one place for a very long time. But I have no idea how long that is. It must be a very, very long time.
Laura, do you want the last word? Or and we have...
Yeah, I kind of piped in there after I said I didn't want to say anything. You know, but Tim sort of triggered something for me, which when he was talking about geologic time and how you can't even conceive of it. Sometimes you can, and when I have, it's hit me like enlightenment. You know, like when you grasp for just a second, it's hard to hold on to. It really opens up your mind and makes you realize how small our time on Earth is, or or our time as vital matter at any rate. And it brings to my mind the whole idea of oblivion, that you know, matter doesn't leave the earth, and we are part of it, and you just kind of get absorbed into geologic time in those moments where you do sort of comprehend it. That's all.
Thank you. Do we have one more minute for one last conversation, Director Joe, do you think, or should we wrap up here?
It's up to you, Donna. The floor has been yours.
Okay, we have one more question. Andy, do you want to ask your question? I see you've raised something in the chat.
I was just a little bit curious how Nancy Berliner, Dr. Berliner, and Dr. Springer feel about man's manipulation of the stones, because as an artist, and many of the works there are very manipulated, and we see that in Chinese stones, less so in Korean stones, where quite often the sacredness of the stones, authentic nature is respected. I'm just curious how they feel about that, or how they respond to it.
Let me take a jab at it, so to speak. Sometimes I think that man making art is just as natural a process as a rock forming in the earth, right? Because man is just a part of nature, and do we really have any control over what we're doing? We're just kind of following our impulses. So in a way, you can think of that as working with the stone and forming the stone. So I don't have a problem with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
great.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, there's very many different views on it. Some rocks are very worked. I'm just going to turn on my lights here. And it's, you know, a matter of aesthetic taste. You know, I collect ceramics that are based on rocks. You know, I'm very tempted by some of the work that Andy has made recently. I love the work that was exhibited here. I could easily see myself collecting some of it. The people that I have dealt with in China, I think are probably like Dr. Zhou talked about the philosophy of Korean rocks. They should be natural. The people that took me on my rock hunting journey there were very careful, you know, to steer me away from anything that might have been worked by a human hand. But, you know, there was a lot of that going on. But on the other hand, you know, tastes change over time. And I'm sure that much of the art that I love, and much of what Richard Rosenblum collected was worked. And I think that that's fine. That's you know, and you can bring out some of the wonderful aesthetics, like the wrinkled look, the awkward look, which I've also heard is translated as grotesque. You know, all of these features can be brought out beautifully by sculptors, and I think that, and I love, you know, how the artists, how you riff on rocks, and you know, you do something different. I love it all. So it's a continuum, and it all has a place and an audience and value. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think in the interest of time, we'll end there. And thanks everyone for participating. This is, as I said, the first of our 5 conversations. Each conversation will be featuring 2 artists in the show and 2 experts in the field. And again, they're meant to replace the type of informal conversations we might be having in person if it weren't for COVID. But thanks to Zoom and technology, we can have them, and we might not have had them had we been meeting in person. So I'm going to see this as a silver lining. Thank you, Director Joe and the Korean Cultural Center for hosting the exhibition, for your generosity of hosting the conversation and this dialogue between East and West, between the contemporary and the ancient, really looking at connections of contemporary art and artists in Asia and United States. So thank you.
Donna,
Yes.
excuse me, when is the next conversation?
So the next conversation, it's October 29th. It's going to feature Elisa, who asked the question, and Andy Moorline, and two other fabulous guests, Thomas Elias. He's the president of the Viewing Stone Association of North America. He loaned a chrysanthemum Korean viewing stone to the exhibition. He's in California, and will also be joined by Virginia Moon. She's the Korean curator of art at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And so those would be our 4 featured guests on October 29th at 5 p.m. So I hope you'll join us and continue to look online at the show. We'll be continuing to post some installation images.
I'd like to want to share my perspective after hearing the old experts. Nice, interesting lectures and experience. And that we all know that the interaction between Asian arts and Western arts has a long, long history. But I'm very surprised and happy to see the Franz Klein's picture alongside the Chinese big stone as Dr. Berlin presented. I was so happy to see the Western arts and Asian arts, very friendly interact to each other. And also the geological factor is so important in the artwork. It's another discovery for me. And thanks to your high knowledge, I really had a chance to expand the scope of my experience on the arts. And I want to one more time to thank you, participating artists, and specialist insight from Dr. Berliner and the Dr. Springer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice
Bye.
evening. Bye.